and welcome. Welcome to our presidential plenary. I'm Peggy McCracken, moderator of this session, and before we hear Sara Lipton's address, we'll award this year's publication prizes. And I will present prizes on behalf of the committees that couldn't be here in person. Let me make one scheduling note. Because our business meeting ran so late yesterday, we did not have time for a questions and comment period. And we know there are members who would wish to speak. So we are at the end of the presidential address at 12 o'clock. We are going to hold that session here for 15 minutes. So please stay if you can. The presidential officers will be in attendance and as many council members as can stay. We realize that cuts into the lunch break. We're sorry about that. We're sorry for the awkward scheduling, but we hope that people will make use of that session if they wish. Our first prize is the recipient of the John Nicholas Brown Prize for a first monograph on a medieval subject is Jana Koolmans. She is unable to attend. Here is the award committee's citation. The study of medieval society is naturally a product of the age in which the scholar conducts it, and our own time has seen a dramatic increase in recognition of the importance of public health and environmental stewardship. In this year's selection for the John Nicholas Brown Prize, Community, Urban Health, and Environment in the Late Medieval Low Countries, Jana Koolmans argues that public health is essentially a socio-political, economic, and environmental effort, comprising a politics of movement and flow. Koolmans brings the growth of urban society and its management of public health into consideration as she examines late medieval public records in the Low Countries. She frames her study within the theory of biopolitics, showing how late medieval Dutch city governments exerted political control over the lives and bodies of their citizens. The book's argument is that public health was deeply important to city leaders and a key aspect of community organization in ways that were proactive and not simply reactive. Koolmans argues that the primary structures of public health control can be understood in a fourfold program, including infrastructure, food and water, waste disposal, and mental health or social harmony. By these means, city leaders sought to promote and enhance their community as a good city. Koolmans argues that these models of the good city were founded upon Galenic notions of flow, moving clean air and water into the public spaces while filth and waste moved out, and upon a moral component that considers public health in a contextualized and historicized manner. Koolmans focuses her study on three specific cities, Ghent, Leiden, and Deventer, but also employs comparative examples from many more, making this a wide-ranging study of urban public health practices and the variety of ways that cities approach this topic. She also regularly brings in comparisons with the Italian communes so that the Dutch experience is brought to bear upon broader trends in later medieval Europe. Chronologically broad as well, the book begins in the late 13th century with the advent of the urban administrative records and ends in the late 15th century with the advent of the ends in the late 15th century, sorry. The effect of this approach is to make it clear that public health initiatives did not start in response to Black Death, but were an important part of urban community management and self-management well before the onset of crisis. Medieval cities are still commonly believed to have been filled with filth, and their rulers and citizens ignorant of how environmental and alimentary factors influence the health of both individuals and groups. But Koolmans effectively demonstrates that public health had long been deeply important to city leaders and was a key aspect of community organization. This book makes a major original contribution in both argument and approach. The administrative records from the Dutch cities were not originally intended to disclose the city's public health plans, but in Koeman's hands, they yield plentiful information about the methods and goals of civic measures to create and maintain healthful living conditions, including both physical and ethical components. What she finds is that the principles of a healthy community animated city leaders and neighborhood communities in a variety of ways. There was no one single approach to public health, but a variety of choices that were made to adapt to local circumstances, all founded upon similar principles. Koeman's approach is thus one that can be profitably used in other urban contexts, making this book an important contribution to medieval studies, urban history, and environmental history more broadly. Congratulations to Janne Koemans. I'm getting weird feedback. Does it sound okay? Okay. Rachel Voss will present the Article Prize in Critical Race Studies.
Good morning. We're pleased to present this prize to Mohamed Balan. Mohamed Balan's winning article, Borderland Anxieties, Lisan al-Din ibn al-Khatib, excuse my pronunciation, and the politics of genealogy in the late medieval Granada. It's nuanced and learned study that engages deeply the history of 14th century Nasrid Granada and offers carefully contextualized local specific analyses and the idea of Arabness, as well as its deployments in shaping the community of local elites through religion, language, identity, and heredity. Balan traces the concepts and practices that were significant to the inhabitants of the borderland society of Nasrid, Granada, in order to present their own affinity, to create socio-political order, and to police class privileges. As Balan claims, race-making is history-making. Specifically, it involves the adaptations and transformations of what Geraldine Heng would term ratio religion. The narrative strategies of the elites, especially those of the scholar-statesman al-Khatib, who lived from 1313 to 1374, were both narrow and broad, specific and vague. The notions of Muslims by origin or nature, Saraceni di natura, lays claims to both a mythic Syrian antiquity and continuity. In contradistinction to its neighboring Marinid dynasty, Nasrid Granada stressed its blood descent from the military and political elites of the Umayyad Syria. Racialization took the form of determinism that was both religious and environmental. Cultural and religious attributes were thereby naturalized and made genealogically heritable. Arabness was a purity test that willfully erased the Berber presence and rejected Andalusi Muslims who descended from Jewish and Christian communities, in spite and because of the reality of permeable and transgressive frontiers, as well as the inhabitants' multiple and overlapping identities. And despite the efforts to differentiate and demarcate the borders among Al-Andalus, Christian Iberia, and the Maghreb, as Balan argues, there are, quote, striking parallels between Iberian Christian discourses that sought to emphasize blood descent and the racialization of religion in Nasrid Granada, end quote. Historically situated and deploying clear comparative methodology, Balan's article makes an important contribution to pre-modern critical race studies, as well as pre-modern Mediterranean and Iberian studies at large. Congratulations, Mohamed.
Allison Stones will present the Digital Humanities and Multimedia Studies Prize.
The Committee for the Digital Humanities and Multimedia Studies Prize is delighted to announce that the winner of the 2025 award goes to the Princeton Ethiopian, Eritrean, and Egyptian Miracles of Mary, PEM in brackets, project, https://pemm.princeton.edu, a web resource crafted by a truly impressive cross-institutional team under the direction of Professor Wendy Laura Belcher. The resource allows visitors to explore an extraordinary number of texts and images about the Virgin Mary, created in these African countries since 200 CE, with a focus on one of the most important collections of such stories, the group of Ethiopian Marian miracles called the Miracles of Mary. The site is perhaps the only large-scale medieval African text digital humanities project in existence. For that alone, the project would be worthy of this prize. However, the resource created by the team over the course of 5 years provides users with an easily accessible gateway into an astounding depiction of cultural heritage, thanks to its meticulously built relational database and easily navigable user interface. This project opens the door to exploration by students, scholars, and the general public, but perhaps most importantly, as the site's creators say, to the story's original creators, the peoples from the Horn of Africa. PEM provides Ethiopians, Eritreans, and Egyptians with digital access to their cultural heritage. The committee acknowledges the complexity associated with the scale of this project, with over 2 million pieces of metadata. We were deeply impressed by the accessibility and sustainability of the site's architecture and design. The committee was also deeply impressed by the project's commitment to open dissemination of data and to the ongoing support of the project by Princeton University Library and its many partners and contributors, among whom the Hill Monastic Manuscript Library figures large. This project truly achieves the most important goals of digital resources: sustainability, usability, and a commitment to the ongoing preservation and access to often overlooked and unknown stories, texts, and histories. We applaud this monumental achievement.
David Shiovitz here. I will present the Van Cortlandt Elliott Prize to Grace DeMolino. In her superb article, Grace DeMolino confronts a question of as much importance today as it was centuries ago: whether and to what extent one who knowingly persuades another to do evil shares culpability for the crimes to which their perverse suggestions lead. Starting with Dante's demonstrable understanding of contemporary ideas about fraudulent counsel in his condemnation of Boniface VIII, Del Molino takes up the role of Virgil, guiding the reader through the worlds of civic and canon law, theories of sin, penance, and salvation, and the poetic creations of Dante and his contemporaries. She reveals a world that understood knowledge and expertise to be powerful due to the capacity to persuade that they conferred, and thus understood them to impose moral obligations reflective of that power upon those who possessed them. Although in the court of human justice, one might disingenuously shield oneself from blame by arguing that no one was contractually obligated to take bad advice, or by hiding behind the fundamental human inability to know with certainty the internal disposition of another's heart, divine justice faced no such obstacles. Damnation and salvation hinged on how one's internal disposition was made manifest in the world. world, whether in the instant one urged another toward crime or at the moment when one's true contrition took the form of genuine penance. In sum, this is a world that understood all who had been graced with the power to persuade others to be responsible for what they did with that power, and a world wherein people still believed there was at least one source of justice that no malefactor could deceive. We can envy them whatever comfort that belief might have conferred, just as we can admire the depth of knowledge and breadth of fluency demonstrated by Del Molino in this excellent piece of work. Congratulations.
Thank you so much. Thank you, everyone.
The recipient of the Karen Gould Prize in Art History is Jennifer Borland, who could not be present, and I will read the award committee's citation. Jennifer Borland's Visualizing Household Health, Medieval Women, Art and Knowledge in the Régime du Corps, is a novel and deeply interdisciplinary examination of 7 illuminated 13th and 14th century manuscripts of one of the earliest medical guides written in the vernacular. Compiled in 1256 for Beatrice of Savoy and traditionally attributed to the physician Aldobrandino of Siena, the repository of medical knowledge and remedies known as the Régime du Corps saw extensive use in elite households and domestic settings. By foregrounding the unusual and often original iconographic content of historiated initials in deluxe copies of the Régime, Visualizing Household Health sheds unprecedented light on the role of images in the dissemination of medical expertise and the central role of women of all social classes and stations in the implementation of such knowledge. So congratulations to Jennifer Borland. It is also my pleasure to present the Monica H. Green Prize to Christopher W. Kersey for Facing Images, Medieval Japanese Art and the Problem of Modernity. Facing Images is grounded in a close analysis of diverse sources from the Buddhist context of the long 12th century late Heian Japan, including paintings, meditation manuals, sculptures, soteriological and philosophical writings, scrolls, reliquaries, prosthetics, and icons. The vast majority of the sources Kersey highlights fall outside the current canon of Japanese art history and are generally little known and understudied outside of Japan. The author uses traditional medieval studies methods, such as paleography and translation, and he also uses contemporary tools, such as laparoscopy and radiography. Ultimately, Kersey places all the examined objects securely in their historical context and reveals the anatomical and phenomenological contours of late Heian Japanese Buddhist optics as pansensorial, visceral, material, embodied, and somatically mediated through the heart-mind, the organ that contained the mental faculties in East Asian anatomy. This does not mean that Kersey reduces 12th century Japanese visuality to a single way of seeing. Instead, he argues that the medieval Japanese agents who produced the artifacts under consideration were in possession of a multifarious visual literacy. Facing Images demonstrates that many of the medieval Japanese artifacts examined in its pages display aesthetic properties often considered hallmarks of modern art, such as montage, collage, self-reference, reuse, dissonance, chronological disarray, stratigraphy, concatenation, and contrastive assemblage. Kersey's thesis is that Japanese art transgresses the reductive temporal and chronological frameworks embedded in the Eurocentric discipline of art history. This insight concerning medieval Japanese artifacts forms the basis for the author's larger argument that attending to these non-North Atlantic and non-modern objects dissolves the firewall between the non-modern and the modern. As this final point indicates, Kersey is not simply arguing for the existence of elements of modernity in pre-modern artifacts. His discussion urges the reader to recognize moments in the human archive when a person of the distant past had a similar emotion, used a similar artistic strategy, or saw something in a manner that is consonant with the present viewer. In such moments, Kersey writes, one is at a historical interface, a true encounter where two distinct temporal situations align, a moment when one is able to acknowledge the commonality and the common humanity of the distant other. Kersey advocates for the concept of interface to replace prevailing notions such as influence, encounter, translation, and hybridity because of the former's potential to help art historians escape the modern, pre-modern binary. For Kersey, the metaphor of the interface productively foregrounds interactivity, illegibility, materiality, misunderstanding, technology, the meeting of visualities, the circulation of artifacts, and the alterity of artifactual encounter. Furthermore, it likewise has the advantage of bringing historical works into a present framework of beholding, a move that is necessary in order to underscore the contemporary relevance of objects with historical depth. The final plank in Kersey's sophisticated and multifaceted argument concerning the relevance of the study of non-North Atlantic and non-modern artifacts for the contemporary discipline of art history involves emphasizing the extent to which Japanese artifacts already played a major role in the early development of the scholarly field. Facing Images argues that modern art history's interface with Japanese visualities has actually been outright pervasive. Kersey uses this additional insight to propose an interface theory of modernity, suggesting that global modernity arose through the interface of diverse temporal and artifactual worlds. Facing Images thus constructs an inclusive historical narrative that embraces the multiple, heterochronic, and dissonant temporal investments of various strata of cultural production. This ambitious study clearly demonstrates the relevance of medieval studies in the current day. Congratulations. Nicholas Watson will present the Jerome E. Zingerman Prize.
In 2022, the Medieval Academy of America established an annual book prize in the name of Jerome E. Zingerman, Senior Humanities Editor Emeritus at the University of Pennsylvania Press, honoring his long commitment to our field. Each year, the Academy awards the Jerome E. Zingerman Prize for an outstanding second monograph in any area of medieval studies. Books eligible for this year's prize were published in 2021. The committee, consisting of Barbara Newman, Linda Safran, and myself, was deeply impressed, as well as educated and inspired by this year's entries, and had an encouragingly hard time reaching its unequivocal decision. The 2025 prize goes to Adrienne Williams-Bayarin for The Christian Jew and the Unmarked Jewess, The Polemics of Sameness in Medieval English Anti-Judaism, published in the University of Pennsylvania Press's Middle Ages series. This book transforms our understanding of the workings of Christian anti-Judaism in ways that are already having an impact in several fields, including Jewish studies, English literary studies, 13th century studies, and gender studies. Medieval Christian anti-Judaism is often viewed through a lens tinted to emphasize perceptions of difference. Jews serve as the most intimate of the various groups against whom Christian communities and individuals were urged to define themselves, but always as categorically other. Williams-Boyarin argues that the key to anti-Jewish polemic is not difference, but sameness. A noun, she reminds us, derives from the early English verb samnen, to make same, and that describes not a stable condition, but the result of a process. Her book shows how and for what purposes Christians and Jews were so often samed in a wide range of Christian texts, from the life of Christina of Markier to the elaborate anti-Jewish libel, The Passion of Adam of Bristol, and to the endlessly surprising records of the plea rolls of the Exchequer for the Jews. The book is in two parts, each preceded by paired case studies that mainly involve real-world figures such as Samson, son of Samuel, who was accused of impersonating a preaching Franciscan, or the converser Alice of Worcester, who wrote letters to the king and used her son as their messenger. The first part deals with the polemics of sameness, in which Jews appear threatening to Christians because they fail to seem notably different and so give rise to category confusions. One reviewer describes these chapters as extended accounts of the uses of Jewish sameness in the famous English metrical homiliary, the Ormulum, as nothing short of paradigm changing. The second part considers the unmarked Jewess. Unmarked, it turns out, in two senses. Lacking the mark of circumcision that distinguished Jewish from Christian men, and represented as effectively identical to Christian women in both literary and visual sources, Anglo-Jewish women have also gone largely unmarked in modern scholarship, despite their prominence in narrative fictions and the historical record. Williams-Boyarin thus undertakes a double act of recuperation, focusing new attention on the social, cultural, and economic roles played by Jewish women in Christian England, while also uncovering for the first time, she says, the unmistakable presence of Jewish women in medieval English literature. The Christian Jew and the unmarked Jewess is remarkable for the deftness with which it moves between representation and reality, acknowledging, as many others have done, the horrific real-world effects sometimes brought about by anti-Jewish libel narratives, yet still mining them for information about how Jewish women and men interacted with their Christian neighbors in exactly the ordinary ways these narratives were designed to interrupt. It's also unabashedly personal. The author worries over the fates of individuals whose existence we know of only as the result of a single inconclusive episode, usually involving them in legal peril, and is determined at all times to know so far as possible what happened and why, and from the Christian as well as the Jewish perspective. This is a book of broad sympathies and voracious curiosities that repays sustained reading and will shape investigation not only into Christian anti-Judaism itself, but also into medieval Christian-Jewish relationships more broadly for the foreseeable future. Congratulations. Put a label on it.
Brigitte Bidos-Rizak will present the Haskins Medal. The citation I am about to read was composed by William Cafero, who is the chair of our Haskins Prize Committee and couldn't be here today. He should have read this. Rita Copeland's Emotion and the History of Rhetoric in the Middle Ages is a deeply learned and exquisitely comprehensive account of the history and uses of rhetoric from antiquity to the late Middle Ages. Copeland explores the multiple influences of rhetoric on the articulation and projection of emotions in medieval literature. In so doing,
Copeland magisterially traces the longue durée of rhetorical discourse from Cicero to an Aristotelian turn in the 13th century, surveying along the way a broad array of texts that include Church Father, Augustine, and Muslim writers, Al-Farabi, Avicenna, Averroes, and culminate in the work of Petrarch, Chaucer, and Hoccleve. The study skillfully delineates between rhetoric through emotion and emotion through rhetoric. Its double plot involves the reception of Cicero, who established emotion as a form of expression beyond style, and the subsequent impact of Aristotle, notably is rhetoric available in the 13th century, which bestowed upon emotional persuasion the important aspect of reasoning and proof, enthymeme. The encyclopedic nature of the volume is in itself a feat worthy of the highest praise. Its nuanced, sophisticated thesis further elucidate a field that Copeland had done much in her career to establish. Congratulations, Rita.
Thank you to the selections committees for these prizes and to the presenters, and warmest congratulations to the prize winners. We now turn to the presidential plenary, and it's my great pleasure to introduce Sara Lipton, whom I have long admired as a scholar and whom I've come to admire as an administrator. Working closely with her over the past year, I've learned that the integrity that for me has always seemed a hallmark of her scholarly work, this integrity also shapes the values she brings to administrative work: openness, collaboration, inclusivity. These are values that have guided her work as president of the Medieval Academy in contentious times, and I admire and appreciate the care she has devoted to our organization at some personal cost. Sara Lipton is a professor of history at Stony Brook University, where she also chairs the history department. Her research focuses on religious identity and experience, on Jewish-Christian relations, and on art and culture in the High and later Middle Ages. Because the time for this introduction is short, I will not detail her many positions as a visiting scholar in institutions all over the world, nor the lectures she has been invited to deliver, again, all over the world, nor will I name her many prizes and recognitions, though I will mention her election as a fellow of the Medieval Academy of America. The interests and commitments that inspire Sara Lipton's research are not limited to her academic work. She's also a public intellectual. She's published essays and opinion pieces in the New York Times, the New York Review of Books, the Los Angeles Review of Books, among other venues. And I know that she has long been involved in community-based work that facilitates and enacts interfaith dialogue. Sara Lipton's highly interdisciplinary research brings the perspectives of a cultural historian to visual art, and particularly in her first two books, to anti-Jewish iconography. A signature quality of her research is the examination of how images mean in specific contexts. In her first book, Images of Intolerance, the representation of Jews and Judaism in the Bible Moralisée, published in 1999 to great acclaim and winner of the Medieval Academy's John Nicholas Brown Prize. In this first book, Sara Lipton studies representations of Jews in the two earliest surviving Bible Moralisée manuscripts, demonstrating that the complex pictorial rhetoric of these densely illustrated 13th century manuscripts needs to be understood within broader contexts, including the changing medieval economy, Christian Capetian theories and practices of power, and various streams of clerical thought about money, morality, learning, and authority. In a study attentive to manuscript form, to the relation of text and image, and to ambiguity and contested meanings, Sara Lipton argues for the mutual influence of text and image, that is, for the way that scholastic exegetical analysis invites illustration, and for the ways that vivid anti-Jewish imagery might in turn influence biblical interpretation and even influence, or at least justify, royal anti-Jewish policies. Sara Lipton's subsequent research offers a broader consideration of the development of medieval anti-Jewish iconography in a study that focuses on new conceptual stances in representations of Jews from the 11th through the 15th centuries. In Dark Mirror, The Medieval Origins of Anti-Jewish Iconography, another prize-winning book, Sara Lipton studies images through a variety of lenses, a consideration of the artistic models that influenced or were echoed in anti-Jewish images, the physical and social contexts in which such images appeared, contemporary Jewish behaviors and appearances, Christian perceptions of Jewish behaviors and appearances, and the purely internal Christian concerns, preoccupations, and ideology that might have been addressed through the use of anti-Jewish iconography. Such contexts do not mitigate the damaging effects of anti-Jewish images, she notes, but they do demonstrate that anti-Semitism is not static or unchanging, or that religious or ethnic hatred is inevitable. As Sara puts it in her conclusion, neighborliness can turn to toleration, toleration to suspicion, and suspicion to hatred. Or, in the right circumstances and with a little luck, suspicion and hatred can transform again back into toleration or even friendship. Sara Lipton's persistent interest in the encounter between viewer and image informs a third book forthcoming from Cornell University Press next year. In The Vulgate of Experience, Looking at and Learning from Art in the High Middle Ages, she explores why and to what effect Christendom invested so much in worshiping the ineffable word through the material thing. I very much look forward to reading this next installment in Sara Lipton's compelling intellectual itinerary, but in the meantime, we get to hear her speak now on Thrones, Dominions, Identity, Authority, and Invisible Things in the Medieval Mediterranean, or Things Fall Apart, What a Difference a Century Can Make. Sara Lipton.
Thank you so much, Peggy. Thank you, everybody, and congratulations to the prize winners. Let's see. There we are. This slide should just help explain my title for those who are not familiar with the New Testament, every chapter and verse. I want to thank again Peggy for that really generous introduction, and also for, together with Hal Moma, offering constantly wise advice, support, and partnership over the past year. I also have to thank Sean Gilsdorf, Eileen Sweeney, co-chairs of our program committee, and all the many dedicated members of the committee, and of course, Lisa Fagan-Davis, for working what seems to me to be intellectual, organizational, logistical, and financial magic in putting together this remarkable meeting we have all been benefiting from, and I hope enjoying. So this is the first illustration in my first book, a moralizing commentary on Genesis 2, 8-9, the creation of the trees. It offers a stark contrast between two opposed groups, good men who live in good works and are crowned with flowers in paradise, and those who live in bad works and are crowned with the thorns of the world. The contrasts are not, I note, in their features or physiognomy, but in their companies. The community of good men is characterized by order and regularity. They are uniform in size, dress, and gesture, serene in expression, focused in gaze, and are symmetrically arrayed within a crenellated structure that signifies the unity, but also the exclusiveness of the heavenly city. The crowd of bad men is utterly unlike the good. They are inconsistent in size, dress, and gesture, and they display varying expressions, confused, envious, downcast, disdainful. They are socially disconnected, gazing up, down, to the right, and to the left, but not fully interacting. The bad are thus marked as different, not just from the saved, but from each other, adrift in an earthly abode devoid of shape or harmony, while paradise is a protected precinct, purged of variation, defined by likeness. In my book, I argued that this insistence on the uniformity of the community of the righteous and the dissimilarity and dissonance of the sinful, portrayed throughout the manuscript as Jews, usurers, heretics, and philosophers, was impelled by specific changing circumstances, economic, political, intellectual, and religious developments that were seen as sundering Christian unity and blurring the borders of Christianitas, rendering Christians more like their alleged others in activities and interests, drives and proclivities, and most disturbingly, virtues and vices. An image that seems tailor-made to enshrine ideas of otherness thus actually underscores anxieties about widespread sameness, a topic I noticed addressed in 3 of our prize-winning publications. So we're in a moment of sameness, it seems. Almost exactly 800 years later, at the quarter mark of the 21st century and in the centennial year of the medieval academy, as many democracies grapple with the challenge of maintaining a cohesive polity in a pluralistic society, we see a renewed drive to sharpen blurry social boundaries by defining good and bad in terms of conformity and order versus variety and medley, or we might say diversity. The debate currently roiling the US and much of the broader world over the extent to which governments and institutions, universities, should impose commonalities, restrict membership, and/or tolerate difference and discord raises complex questions regarding the relationship among individual and group identity, civil society and state power, competing sources and sites of authority, and the extent, implications, and limitations of shared cultural horizons. So in my talk today, I'm going to examine a set of sources that reflect and express concerns about similar issues in later medieval Aragon. Specifically, I explore the manipulation and meanings of a common visual sign, the 6-pointed star, or hexagram, in images and artifacts created by one painting atelier in mid-14th century Barcelona, the workshop of Ferrer Bassa. Tracing the visual vocabulary and artistic influences of this workshop will take us around the Mediterranean, back to earlier centuries, and into Jewish, Muslim, and Christian intellectual, social, and material cultures. I'm going to argue that in paintings made for a diverse range of patrons, Christian and Jewish, clerical and lay, male and female, royal, noble, and merchant, the Bassa Atelier exploited the shared, multivalent, and cross-cultural nature of the sign to embody specific, contingent, and competing claims about authority. These artworks reflect contests around power and knowledge in 14th century Aragon that ultimately led to the breakdown of a period in Iberian history characterized by some historians, though by no means all, as one of interreligious commonalities and at least a precarious equilibrium. The material nature of my sources is not incidental. The crisis of authority grew out of material changes, which were accordingly expressed and enacted through art and material culture. I'm going to close by briefly following the sign into more recent times and offering some thoughts about the relevance and potency of the past, not as prediction or as prelude, but as a source for patterns and potentials. Before continuing, I would like to note that in this project, I have inevitably and gratefully relied on the work of many fine scholars, some long gone and many here in this room. You know, it's hard when you have footnotes all over the place and your audience can't see them. So I can't name them, but I want to acknowledge that medieval studies, like and perhaps even more than most scholarly fields, is a collective endeavor. We do not always agree. We sometimes vigorously disagree, as we have seen this past year. But we still do, and I really think we must learn from, talk to, aid, and support each other. So it's all the more consequential, and I hope for those of you able to be here in person, reaffirming that we are gathered here in our 100th year at a moment that many of us feel is critical and hazardous for higher education and scholarship, and especially for humanists investigating the fullness of the past. My attention to the hexagram was first drawn by this image. The frontispiece to part 2 of Maimonides' famous Judeo-Arabic philosophical work, the Moreh Nevochim, Guide of the Perplexed, from a luxurious illuminated copy of the Hebrew translation painted by the Abassa Atelier in 1348. Here's a close-up. It shows a scholar, perhaps Aristotle, perhaps Maimonides, perhaps a conflation of the two, cradling an open book on his lap and raising an astrolabe to take the measure of the heavens, even as he remains seated on a throne, as if to claim dominion over both celestial secrets and the acolytes, or perhaps courtiers or rivals, who marvel at and or murmur against his wisdom. The scholar's chair or throne is prominently decorated with many small inlaid and sized or punchwork geometric shapes, alternating diamonds and hexagrams, these latter shapes recalling, of course, the six-pointed star, sometimes called in medieval sources the Shield of David or the Seal of Solomon, and better known today as the Star of David. Now, it is perfectly possible that there is no reason to read any meaning into these stars. Francis Wormold, who so far as I know is the only scholar to have commented on the hexagrams in this particular image, regarded the shape as purely ornamental. In the medieval Islamic world, which favored geometric designs over both figural and floral decoration, the hexagram was a common decorative form, adorning ceramics, metalwork, tiles, and stone carving. Hexagrams also served apparently ornamental rather than symbolic functions in Christian material culture, as in the 16th century Catalonian walnut and boxwood writing desk. The limited number of simple geometric shapes, easily sketched by pen, may explain the Barcelona notary William de Olesa's selection of the hexagram for his signum. Nonetheless, this doesn't mean that the hexagram bore no meaning for the owner of the Copenhagen Moreh, identified in the colophon as the enlightened, honorable physician Menachem Betzalel, a figure known from archival documents to have been, or at least suspected, we think it's the same person, an alchemist and necromancer to King James III of Majorca, and then royal physician to James's conqueror and cousin, King Peter IV the Ceremonious of Aragon. Although Gershom Scholem and Gerber Ogema have both noted that the six-pointed star did not become a central Jewish symbol until well after the end of the Middle Ages, the sign began to appear with increasing frequency in Iberian Hebrew manuscripts from the later 13th and early 14th centuries. Here are just a few examples. In some cases, the hexagram here, too, seems merely decorative, echoing Islamic carpet page designs, as on the larger figure on the left. In other cases, though, Jews may have appropriated, I think they did appropriate for their own uses, the astrological, occult, and magical significance long assigned the six-pointed star in first ancient Near Eastern and then Islamic culture, especially when combined with the sun and the moon. Mark Epstein has convincingly read the hexagram in the German Duke of Sussex Pentateuch as a symbol of the protective power of the Torah. Allegra Iafrate has shown that by the 13th century, the six-pointed star, under the name Seal of Solomon, had come to be strongly associated with King Solomon across the Mediterranean world. And around the year 1300 in Catalonia, the Judaic significance of the hexagram was further accentuated, as for the first time it is called the Magen David, the Shield of David. This is found in two inscriptions in a manuscript of the commentary on the Zohar by the Spanish Kabbalist David ben Yehuda. In light of these developments, and given the fact that Maimonides himself cited Solomon as a paradigm for one endowed with esoteric wisdom, one might tentatively conclude that the hexagram inscribed throne in the Moreh Nevochim invoked the wisdom and power of the ancient Judaic kings Solomon and David. That is, the sign was included in this image either at the behest of the patron or on the initiative of an artist seeking to please his patron, in order to situate its owner, himself a natural philosopher and physician, within a long line of Jewish, Hebraic knowledge and authority. The apparently close working relationship between the Christian illuminator, the Jewish scribe, and the Jewish patron, together with King Peter's employment of and apparent friendliness toward Menachem Betzalel, the king shows various favors to Menachem and granted financial support to his widow. We know from various archival documents. The physical proximity of the Bassa atelier to the Jewish quarter, it was a 5-minute walk from the Cahiers entrance, and the overlapping professional and perhaps social networks of its Jewish and Christian patrons all suggest that Jews and Christians had common cultural horizons, some shared interests, and at least at times, and in certain circles, congenial relations. Scholarship on the Bassa workshop has, accordingly, tended to see its practices and products as confirming that congruence and creative interaction still characterized Jewish-Christian relations in late medieval Spanish society, even as perhaps even as supporting the rosier view of Jewish-Christian relations in medieval Iberia, enshrined in the now quite unfashionable term convivencia. There is, however, another possible way to read the inclusion of the sign, viewed in the context of medieval Iberian Christian artistic practices. In her survey of visual representations of Jews in medieval Spain, Pamela Patton suggests that in this image of the Canticas de Santa Maria, the stars on the bed hangings of the Jewish usurer who is hiding his ill-gotten gains serve to mark the villain not only as Jewish, but as characterized by fraud, avarice, and secrecy, all characteristics associated with Jews in Christian anti-Jewish polemic. She notes, too, that the pseudo-Kufic script on the bed hangings imply that the Jew is allied with Alfonso's Muslim enemies. Pointing out that the star often appears in military contexts, as, for example, in this Cantica's illustration of a Muslim army attacking a city, or on the flag of the Muslim stronghold in the frescoes celebrating the conquest of Majorca by King James I of Aragon in 1299, Patton concludes that the six-pointed star was, and I'm quoting here, used indiscriminately by Iberian artists to conflate non-Christian others and to suggest their potential for violence. If we follow these observations, we might conjecture that Ferrer Bassa wielded an emblem flourished with pride by contemporary Jews as a subtle anti-Jewish signal for Christian viewers, even if those viewers were simply himself and his co-workers. The artist's deployment of the sign would then not be evidence that cultural commonalities facilitate cooperation and coexistence. Rather, it would indicate that groups can view shared signs and experiences through very different lenses, to very different effect, and that similarity and proximity do not preclude tensions, hostility, misunderstanding, and violence. Several artworks made by the Bassa Atelier for elite Christian patients seem to lend support to this darker reading. Star-adorned seats appear with striking frequency in Ferrer Bassa's most sumptuous manuscript, the so-called Anglo-Catalan Psalter currently housed in the Bibliothèque Nationale de France. It is a triple-glossed psalter containing parallel columns of the Hebrew, Roman, and Gallican psalm texts in Latin, with respectively Anglo-Norman, Anglo-Saxon, and Latin interlinear glosses, and a Latin marginal gloss, which is basically the glossa ordinaria. The Psalter was conceived, written, and partially illuminated in Canterbury, England, around 1180 or 1200, but was left unfinished for unknown reasons. Sometime after 1200, it made its way to Catalonia, where between about 1330 and 1345, at the behest of an unknown patron, most likely a wealthy monastic institution or an elite prelate, it was an artist from the Bassa Atelier, probably Ferrer Bassa himself, completed 7 miniatures that had been outlined but never painted by the English artists, and added 46 entirely new illustrations. These images are, as you shall see, of astonishing beauty. They are also iconographically inventive in a variety of ways, including the creative deployment of star-festooned furnishings. The hexagram first appears in the Anglo-Catalan Psalter on folio 94 recto, which happens to be the first folio painted entirely by the Bassa Atelier. Hexagrams are nowhere used in the Psalter by the English artists. The image illustrates and comments upon Psalm 54, verses 3 to 4. I am grieved in my exercise and am troubled at the voice of my enemy and at the tribulation of the sinner, for they have cast iniquities upon me. A king seated on a throne decorated with fairly conspicuous hexagrams on its sides, as well as diamonds along its edges, orders 3 soldiers to eject a just man from his city. This persecuting king presumably embodies the voice of the enemy, whom Christian exegetes interpreted either as King Saul in literal hermeneutic, as the tormentors of Christ in typological exegesis, or moraliter in the glossa, as Jewish persecutors of early Christians. Folio 141 features an almost identical second persecuting king on the same throne. The text is Psalm 78, O God, the heathens are broken into thy inheritance. They have defiled thy holy temple, which in Christian exegesis is said to refer to the church in times of persecution, or sometimes to Muslim aggression in the Holy Land. 2 other folios in the manuscript display the star-inscribed throne in the context of similar, fairly generic condemnations of authorities who abuse their power. An unjust judge or magistrate, illustrating Psalm 57, 2-3, if in very deed you speak justice, judge right things, ye sons of men, for in your heart you work iniquity, your hands forge injustice in the earth, the wicked have spoken false things. And an overthrown king, who is the wicked sinner whom God putteth down in Psalm 74, 8. The 5th image that could be read as enlisting a Judaic sign to convey an anti-Jewish message addresses more contemporary social concerns. Folio 106 offers a pointed visual interpretation of Psalm 61, 10-11. Vain are the sons of men are liars in the balances, that by vanity they may together deceive. Trust not in iniquity and covet not robberies. Of riches abound, set not your heart upon them. In the lower register, a man sits on a chair with 4 large 6-pointed stars and weighs coins. He is presumably a swindler or counterfeiter, a literal liar in the balance. Neither the iconography in these 5 images nor the commentary text on the relevant folios explicitly identifies the persecuting king's evil judge, cast down king, or lying moneylender as Jews. But all of the illustrated verses traditionally had been, or potentially could be, given an anti-Jewish interpretation. It was certainly no great leap for a Christian in 14th century Barcelona to regard enmity, injustice, cruelty, or fraud as Jewish abuses. In fact, in 1345, Menachem Bezalel, the owner of the Copenhagen Moreh Nevuchim, had been tried in Majorca for the crime of counterfeiting silver and gold. Though Jews certainly had no monopoly on currency crimes, Menachem was alleged to have collaborated with 2 Christian partners. I should also note that the coloring, hairstyle, and clothing of the liar in the balance in this image are those of a Christian courtier, not of a Jew. In this manuscript, which was almost certainly made for a cleric, not for a layperson, the star-inscribed throne seems thus to indict Christian figures, secular rulers and elites who abuse their authority, merchants and bankers motivated by avarice. Replicating the strategies that I detected in the Bible Moralisée and articulated in moralizing condemnations of Christian moneylenders as Judaizers or even baptized Jews, then Bassa wielded a Judaic symbol, converted in Christian art into an anti-Jewish sign, to tar sinful Christians with the negative qualities polemically associated with Jews. The iconography, therefore, would serve to redefine Christianitas and redraw the boundaries between Christians and Jews. Or perhaps not. For star-festooned furnishings appear on 11 other folios in the Anglo-Catalan Psalter, as well as in several other Bassa workshop products, none of which buttress such a reading, and some of which distinctly contradict it. In 3 images, which in the interests of time I shall touch upon only briefly, hexagram-adorned furnishings appear in scenes featuring Solomon and David, who presumably should be regarded as good Hebrews and models for beneficent rulers in Christian ideology. In one illustrating the judgment of Solomon, that's on the top, the baby whom the wise king orders to be cut in half, knowing that the true mother will reveal herself by sacrificing her claim in order to protect the child, rests on a table inlaid with 6 pointed stars. 2 other images show the coronation of King David and King David playing the harp. In both cases, David is seated on a decorated throne, although the stars are not as readily visible as in the other seats that I've shown. I've circled them in red on the slide. I hope you can see them there. They are certainly discernible. These images could support the idea that the hexagram constituting a Judaic or Hebraic sign, but not an anti-Jewish one. 2 other folios call even the Judaicness of the sign into some question. In one, on the top, illustrating the 7 works of mercy, 2 hungry men being fed by mercy personified sit on a star-decorated bench. In the other, illustrating the ages of man, a young scholar that's on your left and an old man on your right sit on star-inscribed seats. Both men display devotion and exemplify the best of their life stages. There is no indication that any of these figures are in any way identified as Jewish or with Jewishness or Hebrewness, much less are regarded as iniquitous characters. To further complicate matters, on 2 folios, large elaborate thrones with prominent hexagrams support the holiest possible figures. In the upper left, Christ and the Virgin Mary, presiding as King and Queen of Heaven, and on the lower right, God himself from the creation image with which I opened with the throne's dominions quote from Colossians. Of course, Christianity assigned Davidic lineage to Mary and Christ, but one would not expect to see their human heritage referred to in a heavenly context or in a depiction of God the Creator. Mary's Hebraic lineage is, however, visually referenced in a different Bassa manuscript made around the year 1340 for an elite Christian woman. Hexagram-decorated furnishings appear in 7 folios in the Book of Hours of Marie de Navarre, wife and queen of Peter IV the Ceremonious, which is thought to be the first Book of Hours painted on the Iberian Peninsula. 2 of these images depict the Virgin in her guise as Throne of Wisdom, cradling Christ on her lap while seating on a throne inscribed with hexagrams, which in this context we might better call seals of Solomon, presumably to recall both Mary's Davidic heritage and to evoke the wisdom of the king whose dwelling place she was. A similar throne appears in a triptych painted by the Bassa atelier. This is the second image of Mary's Sede Sapientiae. And then a similar throne appears in a triptych painted by the Bassa atelier, which is now in Baltimore in the Walters Art Museum. In a third image in Marie's Book of Hours, depicting the Annunciation, the Virgin kneels before a book resting on a wooden desk adorned with the stars. This miniature of the Annunciation was apparently modeled on Annunciation by the Tuscan painter Ambrogio Lorenzetti, with whom Ferrar Bassa is believed to have studied. Lorenzetti, who was reputedly a learned student of classical antiquity, may have applied this form to Mary's throne because of its association with Solomon the Wise. Mary, of course, was said to belong to the Davidic Solomonic line. She is called the Throne of Wisdom, and her intellect is a central theme in this remarkable painting. The Annunciation composition in the Hours of Marie de Navarre is echoed in 4 other folios, where, however, it is an earthly queen who piously kneels before the open book. That's 1, that's 2, that's 3, that's 4. This queen is presumably the owner of the Hours, Marie de Navarre herself, namesake and devotee of Mary, who imitates the Virgin through her devotions, her posture, her appearance, and her material surroundings. And by way of comparison, I would note that on folio 109 recto, the desk on which a bishop is writing is not inscribed with hexagrams. There are choices being made here. Unlike in the Anglo-Catalan Psalter, here the star-inscribed furniture is reserved only for queens, the Virgin Mary and Queen Marie. The iconographical underscoring of the Virgin's royal lineage in the manuscript is paralleled in other folios in the Hours that also highlight both royal piety and descent and may suggest a gendered component to the visual program. And I'm not going to show these folios in the interests of time. But these folios do feature Marie's coat of arms, and several times they portray her sainted ancestor, Louis IX of France. And by doing so, the manuscript calls attention to Marie de Navarre's own illustrious bloodline, endowed with an aura of sanctity and the charisma of a revered royal dynasty. It is also possible that the meaning of the furnishings is less important than their effect. The fabrics, materials, brick flooring, wood, marble, carved relief, and inlaid objects in these images are all rendered with great care. They serve to connect the biblical and saintly figures and events to Marie de Navarre's own world, to convey her luxury and taste, which were likewise endowments of royal descent and queenly virtue. And in the spectacular, recently restored frescoes painted by the Bassa Atelier by Ferrer Bassa himself for the Royal Convent of Santa Maria de Pedralbes on the outskirts of Barcelona, we find a different, possibly also gendered, deployment of the Seal of Solomon. A large hexagram is embroidered on the bottom of the chasuble of the deacon Saint Stephen the Proto-Martyr. The sign also features in the borders of the fresco. According to Acts 6, 1-6, deacons were to be men, quote, full of the Holy Ghost and wisdom, appointed specifically to minister to widows. Here, then, the star embodies specifically the wisdom of ecclesiastics, based not on lineage, but on calling and office, and especially as directed toward the instruction of pious religious women. Before I turn to considering the specific political and social context for the Bassa Atelier's uses of the six-pointed star, let us take one more look at one more set of images, which helps direct us out of Barcelonan artistic circles and into the wider world. Two illuminations from the Anglo-Catalan Psalter buttress the connection to Italy, suggested by the Lorenzetti-inspired Annunciation in the Earl de Marie, and suggest further resonances for the iconography. On folio 146 of the Psalter, in a scene of Christ among the doctors, a young named Jesus holds forth from an elaborate cathedra graced with a rounded back inscribed with six-pointed stars. And on folio 169, that's on the right, a sainted bishop is enthroned on an identical cathedra with a high rounded back, his haloed head surrounded by large six-pointed stars. These two liturgical thrones most likely were inspired by actual objects. This is the papal throne at the Cathedral of Santa Maria Annunziata, Agnani, made for the resident pope in 1263. This throne, which was cited by Gershom Scholem in his groundbreaking article on the Star of David and also discussed by Allegra Iafrate, has a round marble disc located behind where the occupant's head would be to create the impression of a nimbus. And on that disc is a mosaic inlay of a marble hexagram, or, I think better, the Seal of Solomon. The throne, whose lions replicate those on Solomon's throne described in the Hebrew Scriptures, proclaimed reformist papal claims to imperial power and wisdom by invoking Solomonic majesty and authority, reinforced by the Islamic design elements, which were associated by Mediterranean Christians with the culture and grandeur of antiquity. That's a Larry Nees observation. A second analog is the seat known as the Throne of St. Peter in the Cathedral of San Piero in Venice. This seat, which according to a late legend, was donated to Venice by a Byzantine emperor in gratitude for helping to take Sicily from its Muslim rulers. It was believed to have been the throne of St. Peter himself. Sometime in the 12th or 13th century, it was combined with a white marble backrest made from an 11th or 12th century Islamic, probably Seljuk, funerary stele or pulpit, with Quranic verses inscribed around two six-pointed stars. The throne then was a form of spolia. It also, in asserting that the Bishop of Venice was the rightful heir to St. Peter, who in turn inherited the authority of Solomon, challenged the papal and Roman monopoly over antique majesty and authority at a time when Venice was seeking to become the preeminent Christian pilgrimage site. In the Copenhagen Moray Nevochim, the Anglo-Catalan Psalter, the Earl de Marie de Navarre, the frescoes in Pedralbes, and in other works by the Basse Atelier, I haven't had time to show here, the six-pointed star, whether inlaid in wooden furniture, inscribed on a liturgical vestment, serving as a faux mosaic border, may well have been primarily a decorative device. I'm not claiming that there is an esoteric message embedded in all the inlaid or inscribed wooden chairs, thrones, tables, benches, and cradles I've shown you today. Nonetheless, it was a decorative device used only in some situations and contexts and associated with only some kinds of people. We should still ask what inspired the painters to create these artifacts and why they were associated with such historically, morally, spiritually disparate characters in such different kinds of manuscripts and artworks for such different patrons. In a venerable pan-Mediterranean signifying tradition, as I have noted, the main connotation of the six-pointed star was intellectual sacral power, royal authority, and antique wisdom. This tradition and this chain of associations for this sign was shared by Christians, Muslims, and Jews. Now, of course, finding a shared interreligious, multi-ethnic Mediterranean culture, or interface, is hardly news in this centennial year. The diversity and the hybridity of the Mediterranean has been stressed at least since Brodel and illuminated by many people in this room. But there is still much to learn in examining specific instantiations, manipulations, and transformations of that culture. The changing resonances of the six-pointed star provide an instructive field for such an exercise. For the patron of the Copenhagen Moray Nevochim, a learned Jewish scholar, the philosophers whose works he read and revered, and whose authority he aspired, were fittingly depicted teaching from a hexagram-adorned throne. After all, to a man like Menachem Bezalel, who else would qualify for and claim the right to leadership in a medieval Jewish community and prominence at the court of an ambitious and intellectually inclined king, if not a man of learning and intellectual lineage? In the Christian artworks, we see more of a contest. The many images we have seen of good judges and bad, good kings and cruel ones, fraudulent merchants, charitable women, and alms-aided men, a blessing bishop and a teaching sacred child, a martyr deacon, the Davidic descended mother of God, point to the existence of competing claims to authority. Whereas earlier in the Middle Ages, and my early medieval colleagues can correct me and say, you always oversimplify, I know I do. I'm gonna do it anyway. Power stemmed from military might, royal blood, hereditary claims, or ecclesiastical office. By the 14th century, merchants, professors, and financiers began to gain unprecedented influence. One now might exercise power through holiness, power through regalian right, power through knowledge, power through position, whether ecclesiastical or municipal, power through bloodline, whether aristocratic or royal, or power through wealth. Such claims were vigorously and sometimes violently contested in later medieval Iberia. Kings sought to harness these developments for their own ends. Jaume Aurel has shown that Peter IV, who denied the preeminence of the Pope over Aragon, used his coronation ceremony to underscore the differentiation between spiritual and temporal spheres. Nobles and urban elites formed sworn corporations known as union to challenge and on occasion rise up in revolt against royal efforts to exercise greater sovereignty. Church officials likewise strove to protect their sacerdotal and privilege and assert their spiritual authority. Art and material culture were crucial products of, participants in, and contributors to these economic and social changes. Objects, images, and structures were ideological tools tapped by all parties in the conflict. Peter IV enlisted all manner of symbols to consolidate his power, including sculpture and architecture. Paulino Moreno has argued that the forms and spaces in the palaces of Peter I of Castile reflect his attempt to foster a strong centralized power. The nobility that revolted against this project consciously appropriated the same forms and spaces to visualize their own triumph and consolidate their new power. In a passage published and analyzed by Mohammed Balan in a recent Speculum article, the scholar statesman Abd al-Rahman ibn Khaldun, died 1406, lamented that Granadan Muslims imitate and assimilate themselves to the Iberian Christian nations in their dress, their emblems and symbols, and in many of their customs and manners. They even go so far as to paint figural representations on their walls and have them in their houses and buildings. The artworks produced by the Bassa workshop are subtle, or sometimes not so subtle, exemplars of this strategy. In the Anglo-Catalan Psalter, made for a prelate, figures of indisputable spiritual authority, Christ, the Virgin Mary, God himself, the good bishop, are gloriously and appropriately enthroned. Studious scholars, devout seniors, pious prelates practice their proper pursuits on furnishings that confirm the intellectual and social authority they have rightfully earned and legitimately wielded. Evil or unjust secular kings, magistrates, and merchants are shown to violate or are thrown down from the authority they have abused, which is signaled by their material furnishings as much by their headgear and emblems. In the Earl de Marie de Navarre, star-inscribed objects evoking the royal images of Mary, Mother of God, and Marie herself recall the central role played by queens in forwarding royal ambitions, in performing family piety and transmitting dynastic legitimacy and royal blood. The absence of the star on the desk of the bishop in the same manuscript may therefore be telling. Tracing the shifting uses of the six-pointed star across the Bassa Atelier artworks also illuminates fundamental features of Iberian Jewish history, for Jews and Muslims were often caught in the middle of these disputes. Not all the scholars, merchants, and bureaucrats, legal advisors to whom kings turned in their search to augment their power were Jewish, but many were. Royal governance and finance thus intensified anti-Jewish animus. Increasingly after 1300, Jews were feared, criticized, and attacked on account of their knowledge of magic, of philosophy, of scripture, their economic power, and the services they rendered to and privileges they consequently received from the crown. Indeed, a document records that in 1337 or 1348, Menachem Betzalel was seized in Valencia by Union rebels. He died soon after. It is not known whether he was killed by the rebels or succumbed to the plague. The images in the Anglo-Catalan Psalter depicting evil rulers ensconced on star-inscribed thrones thus echo a pattern identified in several medieval political contexts in which anti-Jewish signs and rhetoric were subtly deployed to criticize those perceived to patronize, protect, and profit from Jews. The strategy may be considered a medieval version of the current political messaging dog whistle, whereby coded language can convey meaning to a targeted subgroup while remaining obvious to the broader viewing public, and so protecting its maker from repercussion by providing plausible deniability. So a very brief look at more recent deployments of the sign shows that a similar approach, demonstrating that the six-pointed star's venerable layered history provides a viscerally powerful arsonist from which polemicists can draw. A picture retweeted by Donald Trump on July 2nd, 2016, superimposes Hillary Clinton's face against a background of $100 bills. Directly next to, indeed slightly intruding upon Clinton's face, is a red six-pointed star inscribed with the words, "Most corrupt candidate ever." Trump's tweeted commentary on the image declared, "Crooked Hillary makes history." Now, Trump, in the face of criticism, vigorously denied any anti-Semitic connotation, tweeting 2 days later, "Dishonest media is trying their best to depict a star in a tweet as the Star of David rather than a sheriff's star or a plain star." The image, however, follows the same pattern and employs the same logic as the images I've shown you today. Six-pointed stars do, of course, have various meanings, but the context for and the iconography of this tweet point to one particular meaning: to situate a six-pointed star against the background of money, alongside allegations of corruption and crookedness, in the context of condemnations of globalism, is to echo centuries' worth of imagery, painting Jews as corrupt, deceitful, conspiratorial, and disloyal, exactly the qualities being imputed to Clinton. In this image, then, the star hints at both likeness and collusion, even conspiracy, between Clinton and Jews. This hint, only implicit in the tweeted image, and probably only visible or audible to those listening for it, was later articulated a little more explicitly. The claim voiced in Trump's last 2016 campaign ad that Hillary Clinton meets in secret with international bankers to plan the destruction of global sovereignty in order to enrich these global interest powers almost exactly replicates the wordings of the Protocols of the Elders of Zion. So images such as this and the many Star of David memes that crowd Reddit, X, and social media sites are, moreover, assertions of dominion in and of themselves. Those who make and spread such pictures are claiming the right both to define the meaning of the sign and to exclude from the community, party, or country those with whom they link it. We decide who and what Jews and the Jew-like are, or as I discussed in my next book project, Muslims, immigrants, Asians, LGBTQ people, etc., the meme declares, and we deny their belonging. But this is not because of Jews or Muslims, immigrants, Asians, etc., inherent otherness. To the contrary, just as the people who made the image with which I opened felt the need to redraw the boundaries of Christianitas for the very reason that a commercializing and secularizing Christian society was becoming more Jew-like, so the impetus for the current redefining of the real America is anxiety about changes that have made many traditionally oriented Americans more similar in activities, lifestyle, and occupation to those they consider unlike, alien, or un-American. And I would just point out that Donald Trump's real estate empire was made possible by international bankers. The effect of this process can be lethal, metaphorically for democracy, because it shifts attention away from policies and problems that need to be addressed and discussed and maybe fixed. And also literally for Jews, or immigrants, or Muslims, or LGBTQ+ people, or any group repeatedly subject to hateful imagery, because history has shown many times over the power of the image to provoke actual violence. Ferrer-Bassa's decorative device never became a characteristic feature of Christian Iberian art. It was not even retained by the heirs to his workshop. It thus testifies to a particular and fleeting moment when Iberian Jews and Christians still shared cultural touchstones, and members of both groups had at least some claim to authority and access to influence, however uneven, and still worked together. By the end of the next century, of course, that situation had changed. What a difference a century can make. Jews and Muslims were expelled from Iberia. Jewish lineage had become a bar to power rather than a bragging right. Analyzing this iconography and the material culture it literally illuminates helps explain why. Thank you.
Sara, thank you for that wonderfully rich lecture. We are at time, I'm afraid, and so please address your many appreciations, comments, questions to Sara in the coming hours. Thank you, Sarah.
And we should reiterate that we're staying for the Q&A. Yeah, sure. Well, if you'll stay here, I think.